Listen, we're back in the book of Daniel. Right back there is one lady, I think. That fella in the red chief shirt. I know his life is hard this season. He went like that. All right, Daniel chapter number 2. And we're going to try to finish this chapter. We've been in it. This is our 5th week in this, and we're going to continue study. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We're going to try to finish this. Like I say, it's our 5th week in it, and we're looking at a part. I don't want it to be overcomplicated, even though I think sometimes these visions can become that when you're studying them. But let's just work our way down through here. We're going to see some familiar things that we saw last week, and then we're going to pick up and see some new things that we didn't see, but we're still in Daniel chapter 2. Our main thing we're going to look at tonight is verses 42 through 49, but we'll have some other things that we'll say prior to that. But what has happened? Nebuchadnezzar has had a dream, verse 1. What did this dream concern? What did it have to do with? It had to do with the rise and fall of major empires. I think you got the gist of that last week. And these major empires that would rise and fall included Nebuchadnezzar's own kingdom, the Babylonian kingdom. The problem with Nebuchadnezzar having this dream, he didn't know what it meant. And so let's quickly review Daniel's interpretation of the dream as far as we saw last week. We looked at verses 36 through 41 mainly last week. And the reason I go over this again is because it'll help us with the rest of it. Because how the statue, remember that was what Nebuchadnezzar's dream was about. It was about a statue. And on your paper that Lydia just gave you, at the top of that paper is an artist's rendering of that. But I think it does help us to have a visual of this. But I want us to review a little bit, because what starts out the meaning of the statue continues the meaning of the statue. And you'll know what I mean in just a moment. If you look down at verse number 38 in your Bible, here's what it says. Look at verse 38 of Daniel chapter number 2. And this is important for us to think about. It says, "And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven hath he given into thine hand." And Daniel is telling this to Nebuchadnezzar. He's saying, God has given this kingdom to you. All right? And he says, "And hath made thee ruler over them all." Notice the last few words of verse 38. It says, "Thou art this head of gold." If you look up at this on your paper there that you was handed, the head of gold, and then you have who that is. Who does that represent? It represents a kingdom, and it's Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom of Babylon. All right? Then we saw also last week, we saw what the other parts of this statue mean. At least down to the iron legs, we saw that much of it. But we saw what the other parts of this statue represents. If you go down to verse 39 in your Bible, here's what it says. It says, "And after thee," talking about after Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom, "shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee." Now, I want you to remember, even though the kingdom is inferior, the statue is still talking about the different parts of it are still, it's just another kingdom. He says it's inferior to you, and we see that when you start reading about this statue. It goes from being a head of gold, and you can see it there on your handout. It's a chest and arms of silver. It's inferior to the gold, but it's still a kingdom nonetheless. And so he says in verse 39, "And after thee, Nebuchadnezzar, shall rise another kingdom inferior to thee. And we said this inferiority is pictured for us in the statue by the statue going from gold to silver. And the question is, who comes to power after the Babylonians? You ought to write this verse next to verse 39, but it's Daniel 5:28. It tells you who comes to power after Babylon. Daniel 5:28 does, and it's the Medes and Persians come to power. And then after that, after the common, verse 39, it says, and another, and it's talking about another kingdom. What number kingdom is this? It's the third kingdom, and it's pictured in your statue that you got a picture of as the belly and thighs of bronze. And it's another kingdom, the third kingdom of brass, your verse 39 says. Who is this third kingdom of brass? Well, Daniel tells us, and you can write next to that verse, chapter 8, verses 20 and 21. Who does it tell us it is? It's Greece is who it is. And then when you get to the fourth one, or when you get to the fourth kingdom, it's talked about in verse number 40. It says, and the fourth kingdom, see, it's still a kingdom, even though it's went from gold to silver to bronze, and now it's about to go to iron in the fourth kingdom. It's still another kingdom. That's why I said verse 38, and the last part of that verse is very important to remember, because he's not changing out what the statue is. It isn't a kingdom in one thing and one part and something else in another part. It's always a kingdom. Okay? This whole vision's about the rise and fall of major kingdoms, and we said that. So the fourth kingdom in verse 40 is talked about. It says, and the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron. So if you look on your handout I gave you, the one at the top, the picture at the top, it said the legs of iron. And we said, who does this represent? As we talked about this, it really doesn't mention who it is in the book of Daniel. It's not named. It's not named like the Babylonian one in verse 38, or the Medo-Persian and Grecian ones in verse 39. But we're given some hints. And we said last week, if it continues in successive order, it's going to be the Romans. So you go Babylonia, I should say, the Medo-Persians, the Grecians, and the Romans. And so we believe this is the Roman Empire. What is a hint within this context, within this verse, that lets us know that this is Rome? Well, it says that it has legs. And we pointed out last week, why would you picture a kingdom, which these legs represent, these iron legs represent, and the statue, why would you give it two legs? Why would you let the two legs represent that? Because we talked about the dividing of the Roman kingdom. We have an eastern and a western, and we talked about that a little bit last week. I think it's in 334 BC. Valentinian, the emperor, divided the Roman Empire into eastern and western. And isn't that, who could have written that except for God inspiring his writer to write that? Daniel could not have known that. The division wouldn't happen till 364 BC. Daniel's writing around 536 BC. You think about that. Only God could have made this so. So, and then we ask the question, well, he names the Babylonians as the head of gold, and the silver is the Medo-Persians, and the bronze in the statue is the Grecians. Why didn't he just say these are the Romans? Well, somebody said this, and I totally agree with them, but they said Rome remains unnamed in the book of Daniel, since the Roman Empire did not actually exist at that time. We see how it's going to work out for the Romans. They're going to be divided like there's two legs, but he doesn't name it, and that's why this person says he doesn't. I have no reason not to agree with that. So last Wednesday, we made it through verse 42. And when you get down to verse number 42, you've already covered the head of gold. If you look at your handout at the very top picture, you've already covered the head of gold, which is Babel. And you've already covered the chest and arms of silver, which makes sense too. It's chest and arms. You've got Medes and Persians. I didn't mention that, but I meant to. But it's silver. Then you have the belly and thigh of bronze, which is the Grecians. And then you have the legs of iron, which would be the Romans. And then once you get down to the feet, and that's what we're about to look at, is the feet. And when you get to verse 42, 43, 44 and onward, it's mainly dealing with the feet and the toes of this statue. And last Wednesday night, we made it through verse 42 as it begins talking about that. And so we're come to the meaning of the toes and the feet. And this has to do with the final phase of man's rule. You say, in Bible prophecy, where do the feet and toes come in? I'm going to tell you this prior to reading it, and you will see it come to light as we read the text. Let's think about Bible prophecy for just a moment. Maybe you've not committed it to memory, and that's okay. But let's think about it for the whole scheme of Bible prophecy for just a moment. You and I sit here as the church. What's the next thing we believe is going to happen? That is the catching away of the church. I heard somebody say the rapture, and from the sound of that voice, it sounded like Jerry Cox. The rapture of the church is going to happen. And then there's going to be a time of trouble. We've talked about this, 7 years worth. It's called the tribulation. It's called the time of Jacob's trouble. Much of the book of the Revelation is taken up with it. It's mentioned several other places, even in the New Testament, like say Matthew 24. It's mentioned in the book of Luke, chapter 21, Mark 13. Paul talks about it a little bit in 2 Corinthians 2, or 2 Thessalonians 2, I'm sorry. But it's talked about several different times. But it's a time of great trouble. And during that time, there's a man who comes on the scene who's the Antichrist. He seems at the first to be a regular man, but he just seems to do what other men can't do. Because God's allowing it. And he brings peace to the Middle East. He makes a peace treaty with them. And brings peace. Can you imagine a guy coming on the scene and make a peace? How far is this man going to go politically? You'll see when you read the book of the Revelation. He really becomes the main ruler of this world, and this is still future. But 3.5 years in, the treaty's broken. War kind of breaks out. Some other things happen. This man either dies, this Antichrist, he either dies or fakes it. Seems as though he may die, but at least fakes it at the least. But then he comes back, but he's different when he comes back because now he's the man of sin. He is the man who's worshipped. He is the man indwelt by Satan himself. This is talked about in Revelation 13. He has a man who pushes him even as the religion of the world, his prophet. Talked about in Revelation 13. This man, he is the head of, this Antichrist, he is the head of a confederation of nations. And we talked about this a little bit last week. When you get to Revelation 17, you see this confederation of nations, this group of leaders with one main leader being the Antichrist, seen as horns. In Revelation 17. What happens to these horns and all these leaders? What happens to the king comes back? And when I say the king, I don't mean Babylon's king. I don't mean the Grecian king or the Medo-Persian king. I mean the King of Kings comes back. And he destroys everything. Okay? And that happens in Revelation 19. when you get to the bottom part, the end of Daniel 2, and you get to the bottom of the statue, which is the feet of iron and clay, that's the time that you're in. You're in the time of after the church is gone, the tribulation is happening, those confederation of kings have come about with the Antichrist, the main man, and they're about to be destroyed. For what purpose? That God's kingdom can come. Amen. You say, that all that's happening in Daniel 2. Yes, it is. And as I say, and I've said this before, and I'm saying this to you now again, when you study Bible prophecy, the symbolism might be different. And they might be talking about a different angle of the same thing, but it all falls into one of those categories I just named to you. Doesn't matter who's talking about it. Doesn't matter if Ezekiel's talking about it in the Old Testament, in Ezekiel 38, 39. If Jesus is talking about it in one of the Gospels, Paul, John, they're all talking about those things. They're talking about something within the catching away of the church or what happens after that. They're talking about those things. So now with that in mind, that this is future, and we know it's future. The vision is about the latter days. He's already told us that in Daniel 2:28 and Daniel 2:29. So let's get to work on verses 42, 43, so on and so forth. And so here's what he says. He says, verse 42, and as the toes, and we just take for granted there's 10 toes. You know, there's 2 legs, there's 2 feet. We take for granted, I guess, that there's 10 of them. But as the toes, plural, of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, what does it picture? Something different than the head, something different than the chest, something different than the belly and the thighs, something different than the legs? No. It's a kingdom. And it says that in your Bible in verse 42. It says, verse 42, start at the first of it again, and as the toes of the feet were part of clay and part of iron and part of clay, comma, so the kingdom, see, it's just another kingdom, another rulership of man over the earth like the others have been. But this one is future, out in front of us, even us today. Shall be partly strong, verse 42 says, and partly broken. Okay? That's the iron and the clay. It's partly strong, but it's fragile, like clay. So it's a admixture of that. Verse 43, and whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. So here we see the meaning of the iron and clay. They do not mix, so it makes for instability of the rulership in that future day. Someone said that this future kingdom will have more of the image of true strength than the substance of strength. You take a look at it, you see the iron, and you think, oh, look how strong it is. But in reality, the thing is falling apart because it's iron and clay won't mix together, and it already said that. They just won't mix, and it's a weakness, an instability. And so let's move on down. And here's why I say, and I want to go through this early, because here's why I say these feet and toes are at the end, even after the church is gone. It's something future. We're going to see that come to light as we read verse 44. So let's read together how Daniel words this destruction of these 10 kings when Christ comes to rule. Here's what Daniel says. Well, let's just read verse 44, then we'll back up and talk about it. And in the days of these kings, he's talking about the kings that are represented by these toes, later by horns in Revelation and in Daniel as well. Shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom? In the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom. There's another kingdom coming. It's pictured in the book of Daniel as a stone and a mountain. We saw that back up in verse 35. We'll read more about the stone in just a moment. But it says in the days of these kings, God himself is going to set up a kingdom. Where do you read about that kingdom in the New Testament? And I mean when it actually takes place, in the chronology of it, at the end of the Revelation, in chapter 20. So, it says, and in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom. So let's think about that. In the days of these kings, these 10 kings will exist in the last days, according to chapter 2, verse 28, and are pictured as 10 horns. And as I told you just now, Bible prophecy, it's probably going to be talking about the same thing, or could be. The only thing is the imagery is different. When you and I get to the book of Daniel, chapter 7, and we start studying verses 24 through 27, these kings will be pictured as horns. When you get, and we read this last week, I'm tempted to go over there and read it again, but when you get over to Revelation 17, these kings are not pictured as toes on this statue. They're pictured as horns on a beast. Let's just read that one more time. We'll skip over to Revelation very quickly and read this. Now remember what Daniel said in Daniel 2:44. Let me read just a little bit of it again in Daniel 2:44 that we just read. It says, and in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom. Now, when you look at Revelation 17, and let's just start reading in verse 11. We'll read verse 11, 12, 13, and 14 again. We read it last week. Let's read it again and see it all fit together. What Daniel said, John says, it's the same thing, even though the imagery is different. It says, and the beast that was and is not, even he is the eighth, and is of the seven, and goeth into perdition. And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. Talking about the Antichrist. We just talked about that. You know, he's going to kind of lead this federation of kings, but he is the main wheel, no doubt about it. It says, verse 13, these have one mind, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. But here is where Daniel 2:44, where he said, and in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom. Well, here is where John talks about that in chapter 17 of Revelation, verse 44. He says, these shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. And John is seeing this in Revelation 17. He's writing as though it's taking place in Revelation 19. But you see, they're talking about the same exact thing. And so, think of it. I ask myself this question. You may be doing the same thing. Why does Daniel 2 talk about these kings as being part of a feet that are iron and clay, and then Daniel sees them again in like Daniel 7 and talks about them like and pictures them as horns? And that, I think that is something we ought to think about. And I'm going to read what somebody said about that, and I think we'll see this develop as we get into Daniel chapter 7. Because remember, we're just setting the foundation in Daniel 2 for our study of Bible prophecy and the rest of Daniel. This is the foundation for it. But why does Daniel see it? Why is it seen by Nebuchadnezzar, I should say, in Daniel 2 as toes and feet, and why is it saw by Daniel in Daniel 7 as horns? Here's what somebody said about that. Daniel saw it from God's perspective, so he saw it as horns. And Nebuchadnezzar saw it from man's perspective, and he saw it as feet and toes. Nebuchadnezzar saw these empires as an impressive image, and Daniel saw them as a fierce beast. Why would Daniel see them as a fierce beast? Well, it all goes back to what is going on really in the book of Daniel and why he's talking about these things. Because Daniel is talking about how Gentiles will dominate Israel. Okay? Daniel is talking about how the Babylonians took them captive. The Medes and the Persians will do the same. Even though they'll let them go back to their land, they still don't. They don't have a king. Israel still not had a king since their last king died when they went into Babylonian captivity. They've been under some domination of one of these kingdoms ever since then, whether it be Babylon, Medo-Persian, Greece, Rome in Jesus' day, or Rome 2, as some people call it, in the future day. So why would Daniel see it? Why would one like Nebuchadnezzar see it as feet and toes? Some feet and toes are key, right? And then why would Daniel see them as horns? Because these people are dominating his people. It's not a picture of a glorious statue to him. It's a picture of people dominating his people. And he sees it as horns, a monstrous beast. And we'll see that when we get to Daniel 7, if we don't just skip over there and look at it. But anyways, verse 44. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom. God's kingdom is pictured in this text as a stone and a mountain. We must notice this fact that God's kingdom will not be set up until these 10 kings are in place. Okay, we saw that, Revelation 17, 12, 13, 14. He's not going to set up his kingdom until these 10 kings are in place. He's not going to do it. That's what it says. This leads us to the question, will God's kingdom ever be destroyed? Look at the next 4 words in this text. After the comma, it says that God will set up a kingdom, and then what does it say? Which shall never be destroyed. Christ's kingdom is the antithesis or the exact opposite of these kingdoms represented by the statue. Because Christ's kingdom will never be destroyed. It's going to go on and on and on and on and on. And those of us sitting in here who've trusted Christ as our Savior are going to be a part of it. Amen. It's going to go on and on and on and on and on. But you say, well, is he going to just get along with this feet of iron and clay and these 10 kings? No. He's actually going to tell us after the colon what happens. He says, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. In other words, God's kingdom, there's not going to be a ruler and another ruler and another ruler, or within the same line, like the Babylonians had one king and then another king. And it's not going to be the Babylonians like we're taken over by the Medo-Persians. That's not going to happen with God's kingdom. That's exactly what he's telling us when he says, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. Nobody takes control of God's kingdom. It's his. He rules it. No one will take its place. But after the comma it says, but it, God's kingdom, shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms. And it, after the comma says in verse 44, and it, God's kingdom, shall stand forever. No one else will be able to destroy this kingdom of God. like happened to the Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians, the Grecians, and so on. It is going to stand forever. And then when you get down to verse 45, notice what it says. For as much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands. Think of it. You know, when you think about the Babylonians and the other kingdoms that this statue represents at the top of your page, one got bigger and bigger, but it was kind of man's doing. Man did this, man overtook it. Of course, God allowed it. He did. But they got bigger and bigger and bigger. But that's not the case with this kingdom. Man's not producing it. Man's not growing it. It's simply going to come. It says, for as much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, it's a supernatural thing. Do you remember when Jesus rebuked his disciple? They were going to make war, and he said, my kingdom doesn't come that way. It doesn't mean it's not going to cause some destruction when it comes, but it's simply, it doesn't take over other kingdoms like man does. That's in John 18:36. He says that. I'm just going to flip over to John and read that. But it's John 18:36. Here's what he says, though. He says, Jesus talking here, and he says, Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, he's talking about the world system. It doesn't take over kingdoms like the Babylonians did the Assyrians, or like the Medo-Persians did the Babylonians. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight that I should not be delivered to the Jews, but now is my kingdom not from thence. And I think it brings a good understanding to that text. But anyways, I just want to throw that in there. That was absolutely free. Verse 45, after the comma, it says, let's just read verse 45 again. For as much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, it's not a product of man, and that it breaks in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold. You say, how does it destroy all these other kingdoms if they've swapped? It went from Babel to Medo-Persian to Greece, Greece to Rome. Well, they just took over each other. They kind of got enfolded, one was enfolded into the next one. Just like Israel got taken captive by the Babylonians, kind of folded into their kingdom for a while. That's what he means when he says that he's going to destroy all these kingdoms. He's going to take care of them. They've got one is overtaken the other, and the other. But one of these days, he's going to destroy all of them. There'll be no trace of it left. But look down after the semicolon in verse 45. He says, the great God hath made known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall come to pass hereafter in the future. And then he gives of a certainty of all this happening. And the dream is certain, it will come to pass, in other words, and the interpretation thereof is sure. How can we know? Because God gave it to Daniel, right? Now, kind of in closing, I want to close with two things. I want to close by talking to you about the misapplication of these verses. And it's represented by the bottom picture there. I want to talk to you about that. And I want us to see how Nebuchadnezzar rewards Daniel. We've only got a few minutes, so I'm just going to go through this fairly quickly. We may revisit it when we get to Daniel 7. But I want us to think how it gets misapplied. There is a belief that's promoted, and I can name two. Amillennialists is what they would be called doctrine. If you went and bought a book by them, most of the churches in our county are this. But they have amillennialism is what it would be called theologically. I would say postmillennialists also hold some of these things in variation. But there is a belief that is promoted by some when it comes to Daniel 2, a belief that causes, I think, a lot of confusion right now. The belief is that the stone fell on the statue at Christ's first coming. And if you look at the picture, it isn't, you and I would totally agree with this bottom picture where it says the gold is Babylon, the silver is Persia, and the bronze is Greece, and the iron and the clay is Rome. But then when you get down here at the bottom, they take a verse from Matthew and say, upon this rock I will build my church. And then they try to make this stone that Daniel's talking about the church. And then if you look at the bottom of it, it says, in the days of these kings, God will set up his kingdom. And of course, they're quoting Daniel 44, right? But then they put in the parentheses, which is not in the text. What do they put? The church. It's not in the text. They put that in there because they think the church is the kingdom. And that's where people today say, help us to build the kingdom. No. No. When that kingdom comes, it'll be as big as the whole world. It's God's kingdom. We don't build it. As a matter of fact, people say, we're building the church. No, you're not. I'm not. It's God who gives the increase to the thing. Jesus is the one who said, I'll build my church. What do you and I do? We're obedient. But here's the thing. The church isn't the kingdom. We're going to be a part of it. We're going to be in it. But we're not it. And that's what this text is saying. Now, let's weigh what they're saying with what we've just understood. When Jesus comes in the future, from right now, and he destroys these kings, he's going to wipe them off the map, right? We saw that in the book of Daniel. If you back up in the book of Daniel, he talks about that. I don't want to go too far into that, but because I want to get through the rest of this. But anyways, here's what he says about what Jesus will do when he comes. Now listen to this, and you say, ask yourself, did this happen at the first coming, or is it going to happen at the second coming? Just listen to what the text says. Here, this is Daniel 2:35. He says, then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floor, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them, and the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Think about that being applied to when Christ came. When Christ came the first time, did he destroy Rome? No, they put him on a cross. Amen. I don't know how you make that. You don't make it that without some finagling. You don't write that in your, in your little picture here at the bottom. That's why I've got this one, not this one, written above it. But he didn't destroy Rome when he came. They put him on a cross. But the Bible says when Jesus comes, Daniel 2, when you let Daniel 2 say what Daniel 2 says, it says that Jesus is going to come. He's going to set up a kingdom when he comes. He's going to crush these kingdoms. They're going to blow away like the chaff out of the threshing floor. And that didn't happen at his first coming. Let me give you some other things. The stone kingdom, or God's kingdom, only comes into existence after it has totally and completely destroyed the kingdoms of man. That didn't happen. As a matter of fact, man is still running the thing to a certain point. And I hope that makes sense. God allows this to a certain point. But the next thing is the kingdom of iron or Rome was not destroyed, as we said at his first coming. They put Jesus on the cross. The kingdom of iron and clay was not in existence at the first coming. And people argue back and forth about this. People who espouse this belief, like it's on the bottom of your page there, they'll say, well, this is how many kings there was, and then Jesus came the first time, and that fulfills all this. But that's not what it says. It says these kings will be in power when Jesus Christ returns, and he'll destroy the kingdom with these people reigning. I hope that makes sense. In other words, they try to look back in history and see a quote-unquote spiritual fulfillment of this, but it's really going to be something that actually happens out in the future when these kings are ruling, that Christ is going to come and crush them. But the kingdom of iron and clay was not in existence at the first coming. This takes place in the book of the Revelation right before the second coming. Last thing before we read the rewards that Daniel gets, and we're going to do that briefly, but all of the kingdoms of the vision are political, physical kingdoms. And the writer who said that goes on to say this: the Church of Jesus Christ is not a political entity like Babylon was or Rome was. And to make one of these kingdoms a spiritual one, like people are trying to do with this one, you know, when they says the kingdom is the church here, when you try to do that, make it a spiritual kingdom while the others are political, it's inconsistent with the whole statute. Does that make sense? I mean, the first one was a kingdom with a king. The last one will be a kingdom with a king. The only thing different is it's a stone cut out without hands. It's not anything man-made. It's God's kingdom. God's rule. That's the difference. Now, look at the response of Nebuchadnezzar in verses 46 through 49. Now we are taken back to the time of Daniel that Daniel lived. He's done with the prophecy. He comes back to the time of Daniel when he's actually talking to Nebuchadnezzar. That's when the text comes back to in verse 46. And Nebuchadnezzar is about to reward Daniel. And let's read that, verses 46 through 49. Then the king, Nebuchadnezzar, fell upon his face after Daniel tells him all this, and worshiped Daniel. Some people say that's really not what he was doing, but I'll tell you this, that's what the text says he did. Said he worshiped Daniel. I don't know if he thought that Daniel was some kind of Messiah type person to God or what, but he worships him. As a matter of fact, after the common, verse 46, and commanded the Nebuchadnezzar did that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors unto him. Under Daniel. Verse 47. The king answered unto Daniel and said, of a truth it is that your God is the God of gods. Nebuchadnezzar's coming around a little bit now, isn't he? And a Lord of kings. And a revealer of secrets. Seest thou canst reveal this secret? So he reveals the secret. That's why we call these messages God alone reveals secrets. Verse 48. Nebuchadnezzar knows that Daniel's God revealed the secret. Verse 48. Then the king made Daniel a great man, gave him many great gifts. Next to verse 48, you ought to write chapter 2, verse 6 of Daniel, because remember that's what he promised to do to the person who could tell him the dream, and the interpretation of it is to give him great gifts, and Nebuchadnezzar does that. Not till verse 48 though. It says about Daniel after the comma, verse 48, and made him, talking about Daniel, ruler over the whole province of Babylon, the chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. So here is Daniel. He's one of the head honchos. Then verse 49. I love this. Then Daniel requested of the king. How important was Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's prayers to him and fellowship to him? He doesn't forget them when he gets on top. Verse 49 lets us know that. Then Daniel requested of the king, and he, King Nebuchadnezzar, set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king. He rewarded them just like he said he would. And that's the end of the text. And we can say, phew, that's the end of it. But I don't know if we'll have a lighter note next Wednesday, but we're going to see some men who during trial would not bend. during fiery trial would not bend. And I'll tell you, it's going to be a great lesson for you and I in the day we're living in, and the fear that the world tries to instill in a person who's standing for biblical truth. So let you stand with me, and we'll put that on hold till we get to chapter 3 next week. But let's have a word of prayer together. We'll let you get out of here and get to the house. I'm so glad to see you, and I hope to see you Sunday, and hopefully we can worship together on Sunday. Jerry Crutchfield, would you dismiss us, buddy?